At 3:41 in the morning on September 3rd, 2006, a drone operator at Kandahar airfield stared at his thermal feed and said out loud to no one in particular, "I do not understand what I am watching right now." He keyed his radio. He looked again. Then, quieter, almost to himself, "There are only 4 of them." His screen was showing a fortified compound in Helmand province, a position holding 50 armed insurgents. And in the span of 11 minutes, the entire tactical situation inside that compound had been turned inside out. 11 civilian heat signatures that had been stationary for hours were now moving toward the north wall. And 4 operator signatures were threading through corridors so lethal that even watching from altitude, the drone operator felt his chest tighten. 4 men, 50 fighters, 11 hostages. No air support, no artillery, no backup that could arrive in time to matter. The question everyone who ever read the classified report would ask is not whether it happened. It did happen. The question is, how did 4 men walk into that? To understand the answer, you need to understand what Helmand province was in 2006. Not the version from the press briefings, the real version. By that summer, Helmand had become the densest hell of the entire conflict. Here the Taliban were not the poorly equipped rabble some early assessments had imagined. They had reconstituted, hardened, and returned with a practical education in exactly what conventional forces would and would not do. They knew the rules of engagement. They knew that positioning near civilians made airstrikes politically impossible to authorize. They had mapped the constraints of their enemy with a precision that was, if you were capable of being coldly honest about it, tactically brilliant. And they were exploiting those constraints with an efficiency that was bleeding the coalition dry. The British Army's units in Helmand were fighting with extraordinary courage, but they were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that could absorb casualties, replace fighters, restock weapons, and vanish into the agricultural landscape in ways that conventional structure could not match. The platoon houses at Sangin, Musakala, and now Zad were not firefights. They were sustained sieges. The men were dying at rates that nobody had anticipated, and the strategic logic of holding those positions was increasingly difficult to explain. The poppy economy was the engine of everything. It financed the insurgency. It gave the Taliban unlimited local recruitment. It bound the civilian population to silence because the farmers had no economic alternative, and cooperating with coalition forces meant risking everything. And the information war, the war that actually matters in counterinsurgency, was being lost comprehensively. Infinite budgets, tens of thousands of troops, the most advanced surveillance technology in history, and the coalition was getting outmaneuvered by men in sandals driving pickup trucks. The gap between what the hardware promised and what was actually being achieved on the ground had become the central psychological crisis of the campaign. The commanders were doubling down on mass and firepower and technology because those were the tools they had, and the tools were not working. It was into that specific demoralizing gap between capability and result where the SAS operated, where 4 men could go when 50,000 could not. The skepticism toward special forces in those conventional circles was real. Senior officers looked at the SAS and saw a unit consuming intelligence resources out of proportion to its size, yet operating outside normal accountability structures, and producing results that were impressive in isolation but hard to quantify at scale. One officer, speaking off record, described the special operations contribution in that period as strategically marginal given what we're dealing with. He was not alone in thinking it. He would not think it after September 3rd. But to understand what 4 men can actually do, you have to understand what 4 years of SAS selection and continuation training actually builds. And it is not what most people think. The physical component of selection is real and savage. The hill marches with loaded Bergens in Welsh winter conditions that would ground most military training. The sleep deprivation, the cold, the accumulated punishment. But that is not the point of it. The physical suffering is the instrument, not the objective. And what selection is actually doing is conducting a systematic demolition of the ego that every candidate walks in with. These are not soft men. These are soldiers who have already proven themselves. Paratroopers, Marines, infantry with combat tours. Men who have good evidence to believe they are tough and effective. Selection takes that self-image and methodically dismantles it by placing men in conditions of radical uncertainty and radical isolation inside unrelenting physical stress, armed with no feedback, no recognition, no end in sight. What the directing staff are watching for with a cold, clinical patience is what happens to the human ego when it is stripped of every external validation it has ever relied on. Most men, even exceptional men, find a place where the ego makes a last stand, where survival becomes the mission, and from that desperation comes brittleness. The instructors have seen it 10,000 times. They can see it in how a man puts his foot down on the last kilometer. The men who pass are not physically superior to the men who fail. They are the men in whom selection finds something that was already there. An absolute constitutional indifference to their own suffering, not tolerance of pain. Indifference to it, a quality of mind that treats the screaming of the nervous system as information rather than command. And on top of that bedrock, our years of technical and tactical training build something that cannot be faked and cannot be rushed. Competence so deep it has become instinct. Reflexes that are not reactions but anticipations. Decision-making that functions at the exact moment when every other human system collapses under fear. The SAS does not produce warriors. It produces precision instruments carrying within them an architecture of controlled violence that activates most completely when the situation is most impossible. And the sergeant leading the 4-man patrol that night had 14 years inside that architecture. His men called him Crow. 14 years at the tip of the SAS spear is an almost incomprehensible accumulation of compressed operational truth. Hundreds of missions. Every variation of the dark, close scenario that special operations warfare produces, decisions made under fire that civilian concepts of stress cannot approximate. Either when Crow looked at the intelligence brief on the Helmand compound and made his assessment, he was not applying a formula. He was applying 14 years of distilled reality. The intelligence estimate had put the insurgent presence at 25 fighters. The compound was a converted madrasa, a religious school that had been fortified with thick mud brick walls that absorbed small arms fire like it was nothing. 3 entrances, 2 observation towers, a central courtyard where the 11 hostages, men, women, and 3 children, were being held. British intelligence had intercepted communications confirming what was going to happen at dawn. The local mullah who had organized the detention intended to execute the 11 on camera. Not to terrorize the West, to terrorize Helmand itself. The message was elemental. The foreigners cannot protect you. We are your government now. And the Taliban knew that conventional forces would never assault a compound with civilians inside. They were correct, for any unit other than the SAS. The helicopter put the 4 operators down 4 kilometers from the objective at 2:17. 6 hours until dawn. After that, 11 people died on camera. The patrol moved through the agricultural Helmand landscape. Irrigation ditches, compound walls, tree lines, with the particular quality of speed that Special Forces movement has, in which looks slow to the untrained eye and is anything but. They weren't rushing. Rushing through high-threat terrain doesn't get you there faster, it gets you there compromised. They moved like shadows, like the darkness had given birth to four shapes that understood the geometry of the night. 800 meters from the compound, the lead operator stopped. He pulled his thermal optic and counted, and then he counted again with the methodical patience of a man who knows that being certain costs less than being wrong. He passed the number back to Crow. Not 25, 50. A Taliban reinforcement element had arrived hours after the last reliable intelligence update. The compound had doubled its garrison. The mission abort criteria had not just been met, they had been exceeded by a margin that should have ended the conversation before it started. No quick reaction force could reach them in time. No fire support available. 4 men against 50 in a fortified position with 11 civilians inside that could not be endangered in any exchange of fire. The protocol was not ambiguous. "Turn around." Crow called a halt in the shadow of an irrigation ditch. The 4 men took a knee in the darkness. He laid out the situation without decoration. Then he asked, in the direct way of a man who respects the people beside him enough to give them the truth without softening it, whether anyone saw a path through it. The silence lasted less than 30 seconds. One of the operators said, "We going to make 4 men sound like 40 or what?" And that was the moment the abort decision stopped being a live option. What they built in that ditch was not a plan in the traditional sense. It was an architecture of deception, in a layered set of initial conditions designed to create a specific psychological effect inside the compound and exploit that effect in the narrow window before it unraveled. The compound had 3 entrances, 2 towers with broad sight lines and 50 fighters who believed completely in their numbers. That belief was their vulnerability. Because here is the thing about 50 armed men inside a fortified position. Their security comes from knowing how many they are, and the moment that certainty is shattered, the moment the sounds and the explosions and the fire seem to be coming from angles that don't correspond to any assault pattern they've ever experienced, from a force too large and too fast to map onto their existing mental models. What happens even to brave men is a specific physiological thing that has nothing to do with courage. It is called cognitive paralysis. It lasts in its most acute form for seconds. Seconds are all the SAS needs, and 2 operators would move to the eastern flank and build a deception. Controlled detonations, suppressive fire from positions that moved, sounds and fire designed to simulate something orders of magnitude larger than 2 men. The acoustic signature of a full assault force. While 50 fighters flooded toward the eastern wall, Crow and the patrol's youngest operator would breach the north wall through a section of inconsistent construction the intelligence map had correctly identified. A junction between original and added wall, where years of Helmand weather had created a tactical blind spot in the tower sight lines. 4 men could not attack simultaneously, so they would make the enemy believe they were 40 and use those few seconds of manufactured chaos to put 2 operators inside. The eastern detonations began at the exact moment Crow and his partner went over the north wall. For 4 minutes, the plan ran with surgical precision. The compound erupted in the specific noise of men responding to an assault that didn't fit any defensive model they'd prepared for. Voices, movement, weapons, the mechanical chaos of 50 people trying to orient simultaneously to a threat that seemed to be everywhere. And the 2 operators inside moved through the interior with the fluency of men for whom close quarters spatial reasoning has become reflex, reading doorways, reading shadows, reading the geometry of enclosed spaces at the speed of instinct. They had a window. They used it. And then the intelligence failure revealed itself. There was a 5th room, not on any map, not in any report. An improvised partition of corrugated metal and salvaged timber that the aerial imagery could not resolve. 8 more fighters inside it. And the 11 hostages were not together. They had been split into 2 groups in 2 separate locations. 6 adults in the room adjacent to the central courtyard. 5 people, Momon including the 3 children, in this undocumented room on the far side of the compound behind 8 fighters. Moving to the nearer group would generate noise and movement that would alert the second group instantly. The children were in the far room, and the Eastern Deception had minutes of useful life remaining. And those minutes were burning. The 2 operators inside the compound ran the geometry and the time it takes to breathe in and breathe out. The math was brutal and the math was clear. They could not move to both groups simultaneously. They could not extract one group quietly enough to keep the other undisturbed. 8 fighters stood between them and the children, in a space so narrow that cover was a theoretical concept, and then the grenade bounced off the far wall. The fragment caught the operator's shoulder deep enough to compromise muscle function in his primary shooting arm. He felt it as heat and structural failure, processed it not as an injury but as a change in available tools. His shooting arm was gone. He was, in the language of operational assessment, functionally reduced. 1 mobile operator inside the compound. 11 hostages to extract. 8 fighters between the children and the door, in 90 seconds before the Eastern Deception collapsed. The decision he made next is the one that every military instructor who has studied this operation has had to sit with before they could discuss it. Because it was not a tactical decision. It was something older than tactics, older than the regiment, older than the war. He stood up. He moved into the central corridor, into the sight lines of 3 insurgents, in a space where cover did not exist, and he used his voice. He shouted in Dari. Not fluently, but with enough vocabulary and enough raw projective force to accomplish the one thing that needed to happen. Every eye in that corridor came to him, because a man standing upright in the middle of a firefight corridor is tactically insane and physically impossible to ignore. He was not trying to survive the next 3 seconds. He was trying to give his partner 2 of them. 2 rounds hit him. He did not go down. And this is the part that even experienced military professionals read in silence before they can process it. The explanation is not superhuman physiology. It is the documented neurological reality of peak combat focus in a fully conditioned special forces operator. Adrenaline load sufficient to suspend the normal physiological cascade that translates bullet impact into collapse. He was hit. He felt it. He processed it as information about his remaining operational capacity. He did not fall, and in the 2 seconds that he stood there bleeding in the center of that corridor, his partner moved 5 people, including 3 children who had never seen a man in tactical gear in their lives, through the darkness toward the northern wall. What happened in the next 11 minutes has been described in official documentation as coordinated tactical extraction under sustained close-quarters contact. That language is doing enormous work to cover what was, in human terms, in one of the most violent and precise sequences of events any operator on that patrol had ever been part of. The 2 operators on the eastern flank sensed the tempo shift. That specific bone-deep change in the acoustic signature of a firefight that experienced operators learn to read the way a sailor reads wind. And they broke off the deception and moved back through the north wall breach at a controlled sprint. They found their partner bleeding in the corridor upright, yet still functional in the way that matters, which is to say still processing the tactical picture and still making decisions that needed to be made. They found Crow directing civilians through interior spaces that were contested in the specific, terrifying way that close-quarters combat in enclosed architecture always is. Not organized, not linear, but a 3-dimensional problem where the geometry keeps changing, and where the distance between you and the threat is measured in feet rather than meters, and where a doorway is simultaneously an exit and an ambush. The Taliban inside the compound had lost their tactical anchor, And they had gone into that night with 50 fighters and a certainty that their numbers made them invulnerable to everything except a major coalition assault, the kind with helicopters and armored vehicles and the full weight of institutional military power behind it. What they were experiencing instead was something their defensive model had no category for, an assault that was everywhere and had no mass, a breach that had come from the blind side, a gunfire and detonations from outside that had promised a large force, and then went quiet in a way that didn't fit the pattern of withdrawal. Operators moving through their own interior who seemed to know the compound better than they did. The cognitive framework they needed to make decisions from was not broken. It had been surgically removed. And in that vacuum of tactical certainty, the manufactured confusion that four men had built and sustained became a self-feeding phenomenon. A fear produces noise. Noise produces more fear. 50 fighters who cannot locate the threat reliably begin to respond to shadows, to sounds, to each other, in ways that compound the chaos rather than resolving it. That was the decisive weapon of the entire operation. The 11 civilians moved through the north wall and into the Helmand darkness with the speed of people whose terror has become pure, compliant momentum. A child who does not speak English follows a pointing hand in the dark when every other option looks worse. The operators moved those children the way they moved everything, with precision and speed and the absolute refusal to leave anyone behind, carrying within them a quality of personal responsibility for those 5 specific lives that expressed itself not as emotion but as operational fact. Everyone comes out. That is not a policy, it is a covenant, and the patrol consolidated at the northern wall. 3 of the 4 operators were wounded. Crow had taken shrapnel in the leg. The man who stood in the corridor had 2 rounds in him that would require surgery within hours. The demolitions operator had a hand injury. The youngest, physically intact and now the patrol's primary shooter, had to move 4 kilometers through enemy territory with 11 civilians who had never been trained in noise discipline, in darkness, and against a Taliban force that was dispersed and furious and looking. The exit problem was, in some ways, harder than the entry. On the way in, there was only themselves. On the way out, there were 11 terrified people who did not know how to be invisible. They moved anyway. They moved with the completeness of purpose that the SAS imposes on every situation, regardless of what the situation has taken from them. And they pushed that quality of movement outward through presence and authority until the 11 civilians felt it too and matched it. The Taliban reaction noise worked in their favor for the last 3 kilometers. The acoustic chaos of the compound behind them covered the sound of their movement with an irony that was almost elegant. At 4:23, they reached the extraction point. The helicopter was already inbound. At 4:41, all 4 operators and all 11 civilians were off the ground, and the wounded man who had stood in the corridor was coherent on the helicopter. The flight medic who attended him said later that the operator seemed more concerned about the status of the hostages than his own wounds, which at that point included 2 bullet rounds and blood loss significant enough to alarm everyone in the aircraft except the man producing it. This is not a detail for dramatic effect. It is the detail that most precisely captures what the SAS actually builds. And his body was making demands in the insistent language of serious trauma. He was not listening, not because he was unaware, because 14 years of stripping away every instinct that does not serve the mission had produced a man for whom the mission's parameters extended to every person on that helicopter until all of them were safe. And that was not a conscious choice anymore. It was architecture. The debrief at Bastion was closed. No cameras, no external attendance. The 4 men sat with their intelligence officers and commanding officer, and gave their accounts with the flat, methodical precision that SAS debrief culture demands, Not because it serves the historical record, but because every second of timing, every acoustic detail, every decision point feeds back into the institutional knowledge base that keeps future operators alive. And the intelligence community's final assessment of the action produced numbers that would have seemed fictional in any pre-mission briefing. 50 insurgents in position, 11 civilians extracted without fatality, 4 operators out on their own feet, 3 wounded, none dead. 23 insurgents killed, 14 wounded, the remainder scattered and not reconstituted in that operational area for 6 weeks. In that 6-week disruption had strategic effects well beyond the compound itself. The cell had been running financing and recruitment operations through the district, and its destruction at that exact moment interrupted Taliban planning against coalition forward positions in ways the intelligence staff tracked for months. The decorations were awarded in a closed ceremony. No press, no names. In the public records of the British Ministry of Defence, the operation is 3 lines. Routine reconnaissance action. Helmand Province, September 2006. This is not bureaucratic incompetence. It is deliberate. The SAS does not publish its methodology because the moment you publish it, you degrade it. The moment you put faces to the names, you create targets and compromise the networks that future operations depend on. The institutional knowledge has been transmitted. The operational learning has been incorporated. And it just happened in rooms that don't appear in any public record. The senior British commander who received the initial debrief sat in silence for an interval described by the briefing officer as longer than was comfortable. He had spent his career building a conventional military understanding of decisive action. Force-to-task ratios, mass, firepower, the hard mathematics of what should and should not be survivable. He looked at the outcome. He looked at the numbers. He said reportedly, and that his entire professional framework for assessing what a force was capable of needed to be reconsidered. He was not wrong to reconsider it. The argument that small and precise and psychologically unbreakable is strategically marginal had been rendered impossible to sustain by the evidence of a single morning, not because mass and hardware don't matter. They do. But because the specific, irreducible human capacity that the SAS selection process finds and the continuation training builds cannot be replicated by scale. You cannot manufacture 4 men like that by giving a conventional commander 40,000 troops. You find them. You strip them down to bedrock. You build on top of what's left. And then you send them into the places where the math says no one should go. The 3 children who were in that far room grew up in Helmand. And they grew up in a province that kept fighting and kept bleeding for years after that morning. They grew up without knowing the name of the man who stood in the corridor, without knowing what was decided in an irrigation ditch 800 meters from that wall, without knowing that the reason they are alive is that a man with 2 bullets in him and a shattered shoulder stood upright in a corridor and made himself a target so that someone else could move in the shadow he made. They do not know. And they will likely never know. The SAS prefers it that way. They do not rescue hostages to be remembered. They rescue them because no one else can. And sometimes, in the specific impossible geometry of a fortified compound in the Helmand Dark, with 50 fighters, 11 lives and 4 men who have had everything that could be stripped away from them already stripped. That means standing up. Not because it is survivable. Because it is necessary. And the difference between a man who understands that difference and a man who does not is everything. It is the whole distance between what is possible and what the hardware says is possible. It is the distance between a 3-line entry in a declassified file and 11 people breathing this morning who would not otherwise be.